Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Our show today, Libertarianism. Our guest, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, Milton Friedman. For millions of Americans, motorcycles represent freedom, rugged individualism, the pleasures of roaring along the open road while the wind streams through your hair. Well, it would stream through your hair if you didn't have a helmet on. When he gets on his bike, every motorcyclist has a choice to make. Wear the helmet and achieve greater safety, take the helmet off and have more fun. Every motorcyclist has a choice to make, that is, except in the more than 20 states, including this state of California, that require the use of a helmet by law. And that's just the kind of issue we'll be talking about with Milton Friedman today. As a libertarian, Dr. Friedman believes in the maximum possible freedom for the individual. Yet he also recognizes the need for certain government functions. Which functions? How does he decide when it's legitimate for the government to take some of our freedom away? Dr. Friedman and I won't be talking about motorcycle helmets, but we will be discussing the larger issues of how a libertarian looks at public safety, protecting the environment, or deciding the right size of government itself. We begin by asking Dr. Friedman just what is a libertarian? The typical definition of libertarianism, in my mind, is that a libertarian wants the smallest, least intrusive government consistent with
the maximum freedom for each individual to follow his own ways, his own values, as long as he doesn't interfere with anybody else's doing the same.
Okay, consistent with the maximum freedom of each individual as long as he doesn't interfere with other individuals pursuing their own freedom.
But as a matter of fact, there are two really different versions of libertarianism. The more extreme version of libertarianism has one central principle. It is immoral to initiate force on anyone else. That's the prime view. That's the Ayn Rand type libertarianism.
So the coercive power of the state is immoral in and of itself.
Immoral in and of itself. And all you need to know that something of the state is immoral is whether it involves the initiation of force. That's one brand. Now there's another brand, which is one I would be favorable to, which you could call consequentialist libertarianism. And it's the one you've just defined.
Oh, well, you've just defined it, but thank you, I'll take the credit. I see the way you work with graduate students. Now, if I may, let me take you through a series of questions that are floating around in the modern mind and ask how a libertarian addresses them. Question number one, the environment. Now, it would strike a lot of people living in Manhattan that Central Park is very important to their lives, and that if Milton Friedman had his way, it would be turned over to the market and buried under skyscrapers and parking lots within 18 months or however long it takes Donald Trump to put the structures up.
It doesn't take a governmental agency to maintain the theaters in New York. It doesn't take a government agency to maintain the museums, the art museums in New York. The Museum of Modern Art is not a government museum, it's a private. It happens to be there are two kinds. There are private for-profit enterprises, there are not-for-profit enterprises, like the museum, like the Opera House, and so on.
Right.
In the same way, if Central Park were not owned by the government, it never would have become the filthy place it became. You forget what happened to Central Park. We, for some years, a long time ago, lived on Central Park West when we were in New York. This was
pretty good address.
During the war.
Well, even then it was a very good address.
It wasn't a bad address, but it wasn't particularly good.
All right.
But we were able to take our children down to the park and when they were babies and leave them with a teenage sitter. And nobody was worried about safety. But in more recent years, until the very recent years, Central Park came to be a place where you wouldn't dare to do that. It wasn't safe. That was because it was a government park. The central principle is that nobody takes care of somebody else's property as well as he takes care of his own. If Central Park were privately owned, it would be advantageous to provide recreational spaces.
Now, you just touched on something very important, because one of the things I'm trying to distinguish here is the extent to which your libertarianism is effectively a moral position. You do it because it's right and just. It creates the greatest conditions of justice. And the extent to which you do it because it works. And it sounds to me as though you have both reasons pretty well wrapped up.
Absolutely. If it didn't work, the main thing is, if it didn't work, it would be an impossible goal. The only reason there's any chance of keeping government limited is because government is so inefficient and does so poorly.
Okay. Now let me just try. During the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century, government in Britain was very limited, and economic enterprise went all but unregulated. Yet that wasn't exactly a golden age, now was it? Again and again and again you'll hear we've tried, the Western world has already tried laissez-faire, let-her-rip economics, and it ended up with the London that Charles Dickens portrayed, dirty, filthy, child labor, just a terrible mess. What do you do with, how did that come to be?
It was a terrible mess, but what cleaned it up?
Disraeli and his social, the child labor laws, and
No, what cleaned it up was the progress of private enterprise, because you had the reason it was so messy was because you had to burn coal, and the kind of coal that was available in Britain was very smoky and messy. And once you were able to use oil, natural gas, better furnaces, all of those things is what made it possible to clean London up. Now, so far as child labor is concerned,
right.
What happens in the picture that's drawn of Britain of the 19th century,
right,
is that there is no image of what went before. Of why is it that all of these people from the farming, from the rural areas came to the city? Did they come to the city because they thought it would be worse, or because they thought it would be better? And was it worse or was it better? In the early days, there are very few things that are 100% black or 100% white.
Right.
There are various shades of gray. And what we aim for is the least shade of gray that's possible. I'm not going to say that all was rosy in Britain at that time. It wasn't. But look around the world today. Where is it least rosy? In those countries where things are run by the government, not in those countries where private enterprise are.
So
and the same thing was true in Britain. The conditions in the rural areas on the farms were far worse than the conditions in the city, but they were not visible. They're hidden. Nobody saw them. Once they come to the city,
Dickens didn't stroll around the countryside with his notebook in his hand. All right. So what you're saying then is that this mental image that drives even to this day so much of the environmental debate is simply, it may be true as far as it goes, but you'd advise greater historical understanding.
But not only historical, present. Where are the most polluted areas in the world?
Today.
Today. In Russia.
Russia? Right.
Why? Because everything in Russia was controlled by the government. There was no, and I keep emphasizing, nobody is going to take care of somebody else's property as well as he'll take care of his own.
Okay. Property. But who should take care of the resources that we all share, such as the air we breathe? I want to push you one more time on the environment. Air. Mm-hmm. Here in California, it turns out there are 30 million people who like to breathe. And we have, particularly in the LA basin, smog beginning in the 1970s, that the environmental movement begins to
come. Oh, no, the smog went back 200 years. There are stories of the Indians describing that as a smoggy area.
So part of what's going on is
it's natural.
It's natural.
But no doubt, the thing about that is there is an argument for government requiring those who impose costs on third parties to pay for them. And the point is, with respect to smog, the efficient way to do it is to use the market.
And how do you create property rights in the air, say?
Well, you do it now by selling the right to emit a certain amount of pollutants into the air. You now have a market in effluent rights.
For large manufacturing concerns.
For manufacturing concerns, which is where most of it comes from. And you do the same by charging, essentially making it a requirement that automobiles have to have
the catalytic converters and so forth.
Well, and that's effectively making individuals be responsible for costs they impose on others. Remember, what I said is, the key feature of a libertarian view is that you should be free to do what you want, provided you don't prevent other people from doing the same thing. Okay. And so the only case for government is when it is not feasible for market arrangements to make individuals pay compensate others for any harm they impose on them. If you and I enter into an agreement to buy or sell something, well, that's our businesses.
Right.
You may lose, I may lose, or more likely we're both going to win. We're not going to enter into it unless both of us think it's better for us. But there are cases like the power plant that emits smoke that dirties my shirt, in which the company is imposing a cost on me for which I'm not being compensated. Those are the only cases, but you have to qualify that by noting that when government enters in, it also is emitting smoke. It's also imposing costs on third parties, because it's always a very imperfect arrangement. And moreover, it always has to collect taxes. And in the process of collecting taxes, it's as I always say, there's a smokestack on the back of every government program.
A smokestack on the back of every government program. By that you mean a distortion in the marketplace.
And an imposing of costs on third parties for which the third parties are not compensated.
So the key characteristic in which you find a circumstance where it's legitimate for the government to intervene would typically be where property rights are vague or diffuse. Is that correct?
And where it's almost impossible to make them precise. That is a problem in the case of the power plant.
All right.
Is that there's no way in which you can say you have to get the agreement of each of the persons whose shirt you're going to dirty, and pay them for the privilege of dirtying their shirts before you can do it.
So, on the environment, the Greens actually do have a point. That is one area where there is a strong case.
But in most cases, in practice, when you look at it, and there are some people up at PERC, as you know, who have, Terry Anderson, who I'm sure has been on your program.
That's right.
Who have demonstrated that there are many, many cases in which market arrangements are far more effective than command and control arrangements.
All right, so now we've got a little bit of a...
But there must be some areas, food and drugs for example, where public safety can only be ensured through government involvement, right?
The Food and Drug Administration, which regulates everything from the drugs that pharmaceutical companies may put on the market to the ingredients in items that we purchase off the grocery store shelves. Let me give you an example. Thalidomide. Thalidomide, marketed in the...
Everybody's favorite example.
Well, I may be leading with my chin on this one, but I'm going to lead with it anyway. 50s and 60s, it is marketed in Europe as a drug to help women get through the nausea that they sometimes experience during pregnancy. The Food and Drug Administration said it had been inadequately tested in the United States and forbade it to be marketed in this country, with the result that thousands of children were born with horrible birth defects in Europe to mothers who had used thalidomide, but that didn't happen to American children because the FDA had intervened and kept that drug off the market. Thank God for the FDA, right?
Wrong.
All right, why?
This is a case in which they did save lives. This was a good case. But suppose they are equally slow in adopting a drug which turns out to be very good and very beneficial. How do you ever see the lives that are lost because of that? You're an FBA official.
Right.
You have a question of whether to approve or disapprove a new drug. If you approve it, and it turns out to be a bad drug like thalidomide, you're in the soup. Your name's going to be on every front page.
Cost me my job. I get hauled up to Congress to testify. Right.
On the other hand, if you disapprove it, but it turns out to be good, well, then later on you approve it 4 or 5 years later. Nobody is going to complain about the fact that you didn't prove it earlier, except those greedy pharmaceutical companies that want to make profits at the expense of the public, as the saying goes, as everybody will say. And so the result is that the pressure on the FDA is always to be late in approving. And there is enormous evidence that they have caused more deaths by their late approvals than they have saved by their early approvals.
So your view is abolish the FDA.
Absolutely.
And what comes up in its place? What comes up
is it's in the self-interest of pharmaceutical companies not to have these bad things. Do you think the manufacturer of thalidomide made a profit out of thalidomide or lost?
I see. Okay.
And you have to have, people should be responsible for harm that they do. It should have been possible.
So tort law takes care of a lot of this.
Absolutely.
All right. If Lilly or Merck or somebody else comes up with a drug that does me harm, I go after them. I do a joint class action with everybody else who's taken that pill, and we sue them for billions of dollars and wipe out their shareholders' equity.
Absolutely. And
Seeing that, they have every interest to be
Right.
extremely rigorous in testing that drug before they make it available.
Let me give you a different example.
All right.
The rules imposed on airlines for
Right.
safety, supposedly.
Right.
Who has the most interest in preventing airline accidents?
After the passenger themselves, the airlines.
Well, it's not even clear that the passengers have more interest in the airline.
All right.
Because included in the passengers are the pilots.
Right, of course.
Why is the government going to improve airline safety? How are they going to do it? How do they add any incentive to anybody to improve airline safety?
So far as I can tell.
Does Milton Friedman really oppose all health and safety regulation? Let me try this one on him. Doesn't the public have the right to know about the nutritional content of the food it buys?
Obesity is a big problem in this country.
Yes, indeed.
But up until recent years, it was very tough for a dieter to pick up a package in the grocery store and figure out what the ingredients were, what the carbohydrate content is, the fat calories, and so on and so forth. So the government imposes quite modest rules for posting the nutritional values on packages in the grocery store. Now you can pick up and say, this has so much fat, this has less fat, I'll buy this. Now isn't that a modest and completely acceptable government intervention?
But let's keep going.
All right.
And the government also prevents useful information from being passed on. Let me give you the simplest example.
All right.
Aspirin. I know, and I know, that you're well advised to take an aspirin every other day to reduce the danger of heart attack.
Right.
But that's not allowed to be stated on an aspirin package.
On account of?
FDA prohibits it. They control the information that can be stated on a label.
Right.
Now, there are some libertarian manufacturers of drugs who have proposed, who have tried to push through the idea that they can put on their thing, this is what the FDA says and this is what we say, choose. And they are not being allowed to do it.
They're not even being allowed to do that.
So that if customers really wanted to know about the ingredients, it would be in the self-interest of the people producing it to put it on their packages. Those packages that had the ingredients on it would be more attractive to consumers than those that didn't. But now, it's always a mystery to me why people think that some experts in a Washington office who don't know you, don't know me, don't know our children, know better than you and I do what we want to have on our packages and what we want our children to know.
Once again, on balance, get rid of the FDA.
Absolutely.
Get rid of these government regulations.
Absolutely. The FDA initially had the requirement to assure the safety, but not the efficacy, of the drugs that they approved. With the so-called Kefauver amendments that came in as a result of thalidomide, which you brought up, the FDA expanded its mandate that it is required to assure both the safety and the efficacy of the drugs. And that has enormously raised the cost of getting drugs approved.
I see.
And if you wanted to have a halfway house, you could go back to the earlier standard where the FDA had to certify the safety, but did not have to express a judgment on the efficacy.
The FDA simply ensures that pharmaceutical companies live up to the old dictum, first do no harm.
Right.
This pill may not change your life, but it won't hurt you.
Right.
Therefore, it may be marketed.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, let me move to another case, and this one I think is pretty tough, Milton, for a libertarian. All right? So you're allowed to take a deep breath before I hit you with this one if you want to. Civil rights.
What do you mean by civil rights?
By what I mean by civil rights is to take a raw case, the South under Jim Crow in the 1950s.
But that was a case of government, of too much government.
It
not
was?
Of too little government.
Well, I thought the South in those days had relatively low tax rates, relatively low regulation.
No, but the government provided for a separation. It was the government that enforced separate areas for blacks and whites. It was the government that enforced the law that the blacks had to sit at the back of buses. Those were all government laws.
In the absence of those government laws, it wouldn't have taken place? In other words,
in the absence of government laws, you would have had a gradual development. It would have taken place somewhere and not otherwhere. and you would have. And look what happened in the North, where there weren't those government laws.
Right.
There may have been, Dave. Undoubtedly, don't misunderstand me. There is prejudice. There's no question.
Right.
And undoubtedly, it has bad effects on various people. But in the absence of the laws in the South, it would have broken down much faster and much earlier. That's if you could cite any case for libertarianism, that's it.
All right, so my strongest argument...
Milton Friedman has told us why the government's role in our lives should be limited. But how limited? Let's ask him about the structure of the federal government itself.
I have a list here of the 14 cabinet departments. Now, 14 is a lot for television, so I want to just go right down the list quickly and have you give me a thumbs up or thumbs down. Keep them or abolish them. Department of Agriculture.
Abolish.
Gone. Department of Commerce.
Abolish.
Gone. Department of Defense.
Keep.
Keep it. Department of Education.
Abolish.
Gone. Energy.
Abolish.
Housing.
Except as energy ties in with the military.
Well, then we shove it under defense.
That's
the little
right.
bit that handles the nuclear,
Right, that ought to go under
plutonium
defense.
and so forth goes under defense, but we abolish the rest of it. Health and Human Services.
There is room for some public health activities to prevent contagion, such a thing as, for example.
So you'd keep the National Institutes of Health, say, and the
No,
Center for Disease Control down
not
in
the
Atlanta?
National Institute.
Oh, no?
Those are mostly research agencies. No. That's a question of whether the government should be involved in financing research.
And the answer is no.
Well, that's a very complicated issue, and it's not an easy answer with respect to that.
We'll eliminate half of the Department of Health
Yeah,
and Human
something
Services?
like that.
Okay, one half. There we go. Housing and Urban Development?
Out.
Oh, didn't even pause over that one. Department of the Interior?
Oh, well, but housing and urban development has done an enormous amount of harm. My God. If you think of the way in which they've destroyed parts of cities under the rubric of eliminating slums.
Jack Kemp
You
is-
know,
Go ahead.
you remember Martin Anderson wrote a book on the federal bulldozer describing the effect of the urban development. There have been many more dwelling units torn down in the name of public housing than have been built.
Jack Kemp has proposed selling to the current inhabitants of public housing their unit, their townhouse, their apartment, for $1 a piece, and just shifting the ownership to the people who live.
If you got rid of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, it would be worth doing that.
All right, done. That's gone. Department of the Interior, your beloved National Park Service.
Well, given the problem there is, you first have to sell off all the land that the government owns. But that's what you should do.
But it could be done pretty quickly.
It could be
The whole-
done.
the whole
You
series of
should do
auctions.
that. There's no reason for
All
the
right.
government to own. The government now owns something like 1/3 of all the land in the country.
And that's too much. Should go down to zero.
Should go down to, well, not entirely zero. They ought to own the land on which government buildings are.
Okay, terrific. Department of Justice,
Oh, yes.
keep that one.
Keep that one.
Labor,
No.
gone. State,
Keep.
keep it. Transportation,
Gone.
gone. The Treasury,
You have to keep it to collect taxes.
all right, collect taxes through the Treasury. Veterans Affairs,
You can regard the veteran affairs as a way of paying essentially salaries for services of those who have been in the armed force, but you ought to be able to get rid of it.
you should be able to
Pay it off.
pay off lump sums, perhaps,
right.
and just get rid of it. Okay, Milton Friedman, if you are made dictator for one day, the next day the American government...
No, I don't
No?
want to be made dictator.
You wouldn't?
I don't believe in dictators.
Okay.
I believe we want to bring about change by the agreement of the citizens. I don't believe in arbitrary rule.
Let me put it this way then.
If
Your proposal...
we can't persuade the public that it's desirable to do these things, we have no right to impose them, even if we had the power to do it.
All right. From 14 departments down to
To
four
its basic
and a half,
fundamental
4.5.
functions. What are its fundamental functions? Of preserve the peace, defend the country,
All right.
provide a mechanism whereby individuals can adjudicate their disputes. That's the Justice
Department.
Protect individuals from being coerced by other individuals. The police function.
Right.
And now, this is both the central government and the state and local governments. The police function is primarily local and central.
Right.
And those are the fundamental functions of government, in my opinion.
Milton Friedman, thank you very much.
Dr. Friedman believes in limited government, very limited government. If I understand his principles correctly, he'd say that the choice whether to wear a motorcycle helmet shouldn't be between me and the state government in Sacramento, but between me and, if anyone, my insurance company. Better keep those premiums down. I'm Peter Robinson. Thanks for joining us.